I said something semi-nasty about your favorite Colombian president. So, I was in a Cambio interview, and they asked me, what do you think about President Aacute sticking his nose into the extradition question?
Not just the extradition, the peace process.
Well, I allowed us how, although I wasn't in a position to talk about President Aacute's nose, we were, everything was going just fine.
Next time. You might get that.
No, this is, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
We're actually talking about already in the public record, so thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Ambassador, guests from Colombia, those that I hope shortly will be viewing this program through a webcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the official and living memorial to our 28th president. The center is a public-private institution receiving some government funding, but raising slightly more than half of its resources from non-appropriated and private sources. The center's mission is to bring together thinkers and the doers, scholars and the policymakers, the academics and the business practitioners, and the confident hope that from their dialogue on public policy issues, each will learn from the other. The work of both will be enriched, and better understanding and better policy can emerge. As the only president we have had who had a doctorate, Woodrow Wilson spoke eloquently to the challenges and the benefits of bringing these two worlds together. Through more than 400 meetings a year, in the presence of over 150 scholars during the course of a year, the center's work and its scholarship commemorates the ideals and the concerns of Woodrow Wilson. The center's outreach extends conversations at the center worldwide through publishing, broadcasting, and internet programs. The Latin American program at the center stands at the heart of this institution. Celebrating its 25th year, the Latin American program has an excellent reputation in this town, in this country, and in this hemisphere for its thorough and sustained attention to key public policy issues in the Americas. The Latin American program's important work on peace processes in the region and reducing conflict is led by Dr. Cynthia Arnson, who put together this excellent conference. Cindy's strong leadership has been exceedingly important for the Woodrow Wilson Center. The center does not develop specific policy recommendations and does not represent any consensus of thought or beliefs. Rather, it is a nonpartisan center for advanced study, a neutral and civil forum for free, open, serious, and informed dialogue. We separate the important from the inconsequential, and we try to take a historical perspective on the issues and put them in a broader context. No one attending the center's meetings would sympathize with all the opinions expressed, but everyone will sympathize with some of them. Our aim is to inform the public dialogue with a broad hospitality to many different views. We believe in the magic of dialogue, and that is at the heart of our representative democracy. Our subject today is in the very best Wilsonian tradition, the peace process in Colombia. To lead today's important conference on a key public policy issue in Latin America is the United States Ambassador to Colombia, Bill Wood. Born in Indiana and a long and illustrious career, Ambassador Wood is now in the 11th month of his critical assignment in Bogota. He's had a long and distinguished career, as I said, of over 25 years in the American Foreign Service, including service, I believe, in Uruguay, Argentina, El Salvador, and Italy. Ambassador Wood, welcome to the Center. We look forward to your comments. The Ambassador has graciously agreed to answer a few questions following his remarks. Ambassador Wood.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's always slightly risky to be in a place where the important is separated from the inconsequential, because you never know exactly where you're going to come out on that spectrum. But I am delighted to be here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center to discuss the vexed issue of the Colombian peace process with the AUC and with others increasingly. So, Mike, Cindy, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Support for peace should be the easiest of decisions, but in Colombia it is not. Indeed, in Colombia, the idea of a peace process with the paramilitaries is in many ways more controversial than similar processes with such notable bad guys as the RUF in Sierra Leone, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, or even in some ways the Taliban in Afghanistan or the Ba'ath Party and the Republican Guard in Iraq. Some in Europe and the United States have been prone to specify conditions for what is and is not a, quote, acceptable peace. And the Colombians, by attempting to establish a legal structure through what was once the alternative sentencing bill and is now called the Bill for Justice and Compensation, in advance of any agreement, have gone through a similar domestic process. In most circumstances, in most other countries, the process is reversed. The government strikes a deal and delivers a stark choice to the world: either support this peace or advocate continued conflict. Right now, the bill, which enjoys the general support of the U.S., the EU, and the UN, is awaiting adoption in the next session of Congress, which begins July 20. It was to have been adopted this session, but fell victim to other urgent matters: reform of the penal code, passage of a tough new anti-terrorism law, and the first round of debate on a constitutional reform to allow re-election of the president. It also fell victim, I believe, to uncertainty about the future of the peace process itself, and the desire of the Colombian Congress to adopt a bill that would reinforce chances for getting a good peace without impeding the chances for an acceptable one. Does this mean that the government of Colombia should accept and the U.S. support peace at any price? Obviously not. In the case of Colombia, we should not consider support for any peace process unless it offers a good chance of ending conflict with the faction in question, reinforcing democracy, justice, and the rule of law, reducing narcotics trafficking, and providing the foundation for long-term peace, social equity, and development. I am convinced that those are the goals of the government of Colombia. But after that, it gets murky. One interlocutor told me that he believed that durable peace with the paramilitaries required that 100 paramilitaries each go to jail for 10 years. Or maybe a little less. He wasn't sure. I agree with him. I'm not sure either. But I am sure of one thing: that we should defer to the democratic processes of the country that is waging the war. Colombia knows the cost of continued conflict and the benefits of future peace in a way that those of us outside the conflict cannot. And the strength of Colombian democracy gives the Colombian government the legitimacy to make the decision. That is the basis for the U.S. position that national reconciliation in Colombia is first and foremost up to the Colombians, and our desire to assist where we can be of assistance. With that sort of metaphysical introduction, let's look at where we stand now. In January, 6 months after the AUC had declared a cessation of hostilities, President Uribe was so dissatisfied with the continued, albeit reduced level of violence against civilians and continued narco-trafficking by the AUC that he launched a major initiative to force them to the next stage of the process, verifiable concentration of forces. He reached a controversial agreement in January, ratified by the OAS in February, for the OAS to act as verifiers. In early April, the talks looked as though they were breaking down. Carlos Castaño, historical leader of the AUC, drug trafficker and terrorist, fugitive from U.S. justice, and the loudest voice at the negotiating table on the AUC side for a negotiated peace, had disappeared. The leadership of the AUC increasingly was in the hands of long-term narco-traffickers, without even the veneer of a historical political agenda. Peace Commissioner Restrepo had made a trip to Córdoba Department, where the talks were being held, to reverse his previous efforts to get an agreement that included all major AUC factions, and instead to simply see if any of the factions were willing to sign on. He was not successful. The U.S. Embassy was loudly criticizing the paramilitaries for their open descent into unambiguous narco-terrorism. They have lost their disguise, was our cry, although it was never much of a disguise. On April 27, President Uribe issued an ultimatum to the paramilitaries, which may have been a pivotal event. Its key elements were, first, a first-ever accusation that the supposedly patriotic paramilitaries were targeting President Uribe for assassination, a true statement. Second, a statement that the peace process could not advance in the face of continued violations of the cessation of hostilities, drug trafficking, and other paramilitary violence. Third, a call for the paramilitaries to accept a concentration zone with clear rules under OAS verification. Four, a threat that, otherwise, the government would continue to fight until they were annihilated. And five, a confirmation that extradition was not a subject for negotiation. Although the U.S. had no hand in drafting the statement, we strongly supported it, most directly during Undersecretary Grossman's visit in early May. Less than 2 weeks after that statement, AUC leadership advised the government that they were prepared to sign the draft peace agreement. Key elements of the agreement were that the 10 most senior AUC leaders, with their bodyguards, about 400 persons in all, would concentrate in an area of 142 square miles, that's less than 12 miles by 12 miles, for 6 months, extendable upon agreement by the parties. Concentration of leaders was an explicit first step toward development of a timetable for concentration of all paramilitary forces. Once concentrated, paramilitary personnel would enter and leave the zone only with the express permission of the government and only for the purpose of activities related to the peace process. There continues to be discussion about how many paramilitaries can be allowed out of the zone at any one time. The paramilitaries inside the zone would not undertake illicit activities, recruit, pressure, or threaten the local population or visitors, train or order or coordinate illegal actions. This is crucial. Concentrated paramilitary leaders will retain responsibility for the actions of their forces. So concentration does not give them a get-out-of-jail-free card. Arrest warrants would be suspended for paramilitaries within the zone, but national law would continue in full force there, and the government could take law enforcement action in response to any infraction. So the government can respond to any infraction by the leaders or their unconcentrated cadre. The OAS would verify compliance, including by receiving an inventory of all communications and equipment, arms, and ammunition held by the paramilitaries in the zone. The communications equipment is important because it is the basis for the continuing responsibility of the leaders for their cadre. They can stay in touch with their cadre. The military and the police would establish a security perimeter around the zone. The 11th Army Brigade already has made its initial deployments. The governments had not been able to station troops in that area for more than a decade prior to this agreement. So there's a simple tactical improvement as a result of the agreement. On June 15th, the government promulgated decrees 91 and 92, creating the zone of concentration and formally beginning the process of negotiation toward a final peace agreement with the paramilitaries. That same day, the paramilitaries and the government announced that concentration would take place July 1. This is 2 weeks later than the original date for concentration, and skepticism regarding paramilitary compliance remains high, including, I might add, with me. The U.S. welcomed the beginning of peace negotiations on June 16, emphasizing the contribution that a credible peace process could make toward ending the violence, the importance that the process in no way prejudiced the extradition of Colombians indicted in the United States, and the need to bring gross violators of human rights and major drug traffickers to trial. In Colombia, the embassy has emphasized steadily in its public statements that the agreement is only as good as paramilitary compliance makes it. AUC leaders have requested the presence of the U.S. at the negotiating table. We have made clear that we would not even consider such a step. As the peace process with the paramilitaries was taking its most recent steps, on May 30, President Fox of Mexico offered Mexican facilitation for a peace process with the ELN, one of the oldest but now the weakest Colombian illegal armed group. Recent press accounts have noted that the ELN seemed to have only 3 options: to lose on the battlefield, to be absorbed by the FARC, which has a totally different approach, and to which the ELN has lost both territory and stature, or to negotiate with the government. European repudiation of the ELN following the kidnapping last fall of European and Israeli eco-tourists may have influenced the ELN to move toward peace talks. The successful negotiations by the government that achieved their safe release without damaging concessions may have indicated that, unlike the FARC, the ELN could be dealt with and would comply with its commitments. President Uribe has called for prudence in developing an ELN process, not least to limit the ability of the paramilitaries in the ELN to play 2 separate processes against each other. Nevertheless, on June 2nd, the government made an extraordinary gesture. It released for 1 day convicted ELN leader Francisco Galan to meet with Vice President Santos and Peace Commissioner Restrepo, and to deliver the ELN position in the National Congress at a meeting on anti-personnel mines. Although the ELN response, calling for a bilateral cessation of hostilities, the equivalent of renunciation of government authority, and immediate release of all so-called political prisoners was not acceptable, the process continues. On June 16, Mexico named experienced diplomat and former ambassador to Colombia, Andrés Valencia, as facilitator. And on June 18, he met with Peace Commissioner Restrepo for the first time, and shortly thereafter with Mr. Galan in an extended get acquainted session. On June 24, the ELN Central Council named Galan as their official negotiator, indicating continued interest in the process. I met with Ambassador Valencia last week. I assured him that the U.S. has long supported a process with the ELN, provided it met President Uribe's precondition for all such talks, declaration of a unilateral ceasefire, and was a serious process. We will have to see how it unfolds. In the interest of completeness, a few words about the peace process, or lack of one, with the FARC. The FARC has made numerous overtures through the UN, the Church, and other intermediaries. With the UN, they were seeking simply an initial meeting, but the preparatory talks foundered over the nature of the event. The UN wanted a serious discussion on neutral ground. The FARC wanted a media event involving either concession by the government of secure territory inside of Colombia for the talks, or recognition of FARC status in some form by a foreign host government. The talks broke down. More to the point, the FARC have never come close to accepting the unavoidable precondition of the government for a peace process, a unilateral declaration of a cessation of hostilities to include an end to narco-trafficking. I've held 2 topics for last because they are meant to apply not to any specific peace process, but to any process with any of Colombia's terrorist groups: the legal structure for peace under the draft law of justice and compensation, and the organizational preparations made by the Colombian government to implement demobilization and reinsertion of armed groups. The draft law of justice and compensation has evolved substantially since it was first introduced last fall. In essence, it provides a legal structure in the event that an illegal armed group declares a unilateral cessation of hostilities, signs a final peace agreement, and provides the government with a list of its members to be considered for benefits under the law. If at any stage any individual ex-combatant, so it's not simply group compliance, it's individual compliance, if at any stage an individual ex-combatant fails to fulfill his obligations under the law, he immediately loses the benefits and becomes subject to full law enforcement action. The steps in the current draft are as follows. The ex-combatant promises to meet the requirements levied by a new tribunal for truth, justice, and compensation regarding assisting victims, paying compensation, and cooperating in further peacemaking. In particular, the ex-combatant must assist the prosecutors and the tribunal in examining his own case and disclose his economic assets. The prosecutor general reviews the ex-combatant's record, condenses all charges into one case, and sends its recommendations for a normal sentence to the tribunal. The tribunal reaches a verdict and sets the sentence. At that point, the individual has been formally convicted and sentenced according to the usual Colombian norms. Then the tribunal sends the case to the president with its recommendation that the ex-combatant be given or denied benefits, i.e., an alternative sentence. If the recommendation is denial, the individual receives the full sentence, and the president, really the Ministry of Interior, which is responsible for the prison system, determines where he will serve it. If the recommendation is to grant benefits under the law, the president makes the decision, either in favor or against benefits, and returns the case to the tribunal. Again, if he decides against benefits, the ministry determines where the sentence will be served. If the president decides in favor of granting benefits for this individual, the tribunal sets an alternative sentence between 5 and 10 years of prison and imposes obligations for compensation and peacemaking actions. Again, the president determines where the sentence will be served. After serving his sentence and fulfilling all other obligations, and again, the sentence is between 5 and 10 years, the beneficiary is placed under supervised parole for 10 years. Or, if his alternative sentence was the minimum alternative sentence of 5 years, he is placed under supervised parole for an additional 5 years. If at the end of that period, the individual has fulfilled every obligation, he is a free man. A couple of comments. First, this is a law meant for the leaders and most violent members of these organizations. Only those found personally responsible for major violent crimes or narco-trafficking would pass under it. Most members of the illegal armed groups would probably be found guilty of so-called political crimes, which would be amnestied. Second, the payment of compensation under the law should not be confused with restoration of stolen property or wrongfully acquired property. Compensation is in addition to restoration of illegally acquired property. So the former combatant faces both confiscation of illegal assets and compensation for illegal actions paid from possibly legal assets. 2 blows to his pocketbook. Third, no promises regarding extradition are made or implied in any part of the law. This is important, and the reason we harp on extradition is, from the U.S. point of view, someone sought for extradition is someone who has violated U.S. law and done direct damage to U.S. citizens. Those who are sought in extradition are the ones with whom the are the bad guys, with whom the United States has the most direct connection, the most immediate interest, and the strongest desire for American-style justice. Finally, as I said earlier, the law is still in draft form, and now not one but both terrorist organizations involved in peace talks will be reacting to it at the negotiating table. The government and Peace Commissioner Restrepo in particular have been very, very firm regarding jail time, compensation, and extradition, in spite of intense pressure from the paramilitaries. The ELN is likely to adhere to much the same line as the paramilitaries. The U.S., the Europeans, and the UN have all said that they can generally support the draft as it now stands. We will continue to support a tough line with terrorists. Demobilization and reinsertion. The government's plans for demobilization and reinsertion are also meant to apply to all groups entering a peace process. But there clearly will be operational differences, if only because of the difference in size between the few thousand ELN members and the much larger AUC paramilitaries. In general, the process is under the control of, first, the Peace Commissioner during negotiations; second, the Ministry of Defense during concentration and demobilization, which includes identification by the National Civil Registry and judicial interrogation by the Prosecutor General; and third, the Ministry of Justice and Interior during the reinsertion phase, with the assistance of a number of other governmental and non-governmental social entities to help with health, education, and placement. The OAS has accompanied the Peace Commissioner at all recent negotiating sessions, not as a mediator, but as an advisor to the government, and is responsible for verification of all operational phases. The Medellin-based demobilization of the Bloque Cacique Nutibara, which we will hear about later in today's program, has reached the final stages of reinsertion and has many practical experiences to share. But the government's national effort has not yet passed the initial negotiating stage with any group. As I indicated, it was only on June 15th that the government formally ended the pre-negotiation with the paramilitary AUC group and began final negotiations. The negotiating phase with the AUC paramilitaries has been difficult. Reports are that the disappearance of Carlos Castaño was related to his willingness, in contrast to the other AUC negotiators, to accept government demands, and that he was a source of internal dissension and insecurity among AUC leaders. Pardon me. Reports are also that Dr. Restrepo has taken a very tough line through shouting matches and threats to leave the table. President Uribe's high popularity and the continuing possibility of re-election give Restrepo a strong negotiating base. Negotiations are taking place only within the limits of the April 27 declaration and the draft law of justice and compensation, although the paramilitaries regularly attempt to sidestep both. As a result, the discussions have operationally related to two chief subjects: modalities for the concentration of the leaders and the subsequent concentration and demobilization of their forces. Regarding the modalities, there already have been heated disputes regarding, for example, access by the paramilitaries to media and other outsiders. Regarding concentration of the rank and file, the first goal is to establish a calendar for concentration and demobilization. The government goal, a hopeful one, is to concentrate up to 4,000 paramilitaries by year's end. The concentration and demobilization phases are modeled after the government's experience with some 4,000 deserters from all terrorist groups. Each former combatant would be identified, not least to enable a check of criminal records for past crimes. Not an easy task, for instance, for paramilitaries carried off as child soldiers years ago. The Defense Ministry would debrief for intelligence about the organization and operation of the paramilitaries. The deserter program has been an important source of such information. The Prosecutor General would interview the former combatants for information relating to possible prosecution, application of the law of justice and compensation, and general legal issues. Following satisfactory interviews, the ex-combatant would sign a pledge to permanently separate himself from the organization and its activities, acknowledging that any failure to cooperate would leave him open for full action of law enforcement. That would constitute formal demobilization. Finally, entry into the reinsertion program and preparation for reinsertion. This phase is supposed to last for no more than a year for each reinsertado, except in the case of child soldiers. In all cases, it is expected that the National Institute for Family Welfare, the Ministries of Health and Education, the National Training Institute, and a number of others would work to prepare the ex-combatant for return to normal life in body and in mind. In cases where ex-combatants want to return to farms or other places they formerly worked, they normally would be allowed to go. In other cases, they would be prepared for some sort of regular work. They would receive a stipend during this period in exchange for cooperation and work that did not interfere with the other tasks of this phase. Estimates have placed the cost of the whole demobilization process at about $8,500 per head, or more than $42 million for 5,000 reinsertados. The government is still defining the specific elements of the program, so the precise numbers are not yet available. They may even be affected by the negotiations themselves, so we may not be able to know the costs in complete detail for a while longer. Although the cash-strapped government will pay the lion's share of the cost of concentration and demobilization, they need help on the more humanitarian reinsertion side. They are requesting that the international community contribute up to $5,700 per reinsertado. We are studying the policy, budgetary, and legal implications of U.S. assistance. One thing is clear. The cost of reinsertion for each ex-combatant would be substantially lower than the cost of his continued illegal activity, plus the costs of confronting and defeating him militarily. Not to mention the continued suffering by the population and the armed forces that would entail. A good peace is also a good deal. A bad peace, of course, is a very bad deal. The OAS verification mission has also faced financial difficulties. The U.S. provided several $100,000 to help OAS mission head Sergio Caramagna launch his office. The government just provided $1 million for further preparation and development, but long-term funding is unclear. Until that is pinned down, Caramagna, who is working almost alone, says he is unable to write contracts with the experts he needs to do the actual work. In addition, Caramagna says that he has critical needs for vehicles and communications gear. In all such operations around the world, mobility and communications compensate for not having sufficient personnel to be in all places at all times. Sweden appears to have offered to send an expert to work in Caramagna's office, who will come with some equipment. The U.S. recently reached a decision that continued assistance to the OAS is legally possible for us if there are no changes in the program. But since the program is still in development, there will be changes. So we are working to broaden that decision. Bottom line, thank you for your attention to what has been a very long and probably too detailed presentation. In closing, I'd like to leave you with some concluding thoughts. First, this is hard. Finding a balance between peace and justice necessarily implies that neither goal will be served perfectly. So judgment is a key factor. The draft law of justice and compensation has been toughened substantially since its introduction, precisely because voices inside and outside Colombia didn't think the first draft got it exactly right. That debate will continue inside and outside Colombia. Second, this is uncertain. The paramilitaries are composed of many different kinds of people. Child soldiers who never had a chance to know better. Campesinos who may have been caught up in a struggle they did not understand, or may have felt that their safety and the safety of their families required that they ally with one armed side or another. Thugs and psychopaths looking for a way to realize their desire to prey on society are another group. Leaders of the AUC who range from those who once may have had an ideology but slipped into narco-terrorism and abuse over the years, all the way up to the hardest core, most cynical, most cruel drug lords on the face of the earth, hoping to use the so-called political aspects of the AUC movement to disguise and shield their real activities. And leaders to be, waiting for their time when they can order the depredations and reap the profits. By the way, the other illegal armed groups share this horribly mixed profile. In no plausible scenario will all of these persons participate in any meaningful peace process. But to be able to pull 10,000 or 5,000 or even 1,000 fighters off the battlefield in the country with the largest and longest-lived terrorist movement in the world is a goal worth working for. And I might add, those who refuse to participate in a meaningful process will have branded themselves forever as targets. Finally, this is a necessary part of our policy, both as a part of our partnership with the Uribe administration and as part of our unrelenting war on terrorism and narco-trafficking. Just as we support alternative development to undermine the economic and social structure that has contributed to the growth of narco-terrorism, we must also support a pull strategy to complement our forceful push strategy to destroy the political and military structure of the illegal armed groups. And we have to get it right. Thank you again for your attention, and thanks again to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for hosting this important discussion, so directly relevant to the well-being of our citizens as they live their daily lives in American cities, suburbs, and towns. Thank you all very much. I'd love to sit down. There was a flight from Atlanta was delayed. I got in about 3:45 this morning, so I could probably be more coherent than I'm about to be.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions, and I open the floor. You will be given a microphone. Would you please identify yourself? First question. Ariel, wait for this.
Thanks for taking my question. My name is Ariel Mendez, and I work here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was wondering if you might be able to shed some light on a recent proposal that seems well-intentioned but may be wrong-headed. I was wondering why there seems to be so much support within Congress and the administration for increasing the number of civilian and military American personnel in Colombia from something like 600 to 1,000 in Colombia. It seems that it may unnecessarily put the popular support for U.S. aid to Colombia at risk if something were to happen, presuming that the greater number of U.S. personnel in Colombia, the greater risk for being killed or abducted. Why isn't there more emphasis on training Colombians either here in the U.S. through institutions like the School of the Americas, or if they must be trained in Colombia, as far away from paramilitary organizations as possible?
A couple of quick thoughts here. First, the reason for seeking an increase in the legislative cap is actually a quite practical one. And that is that as ambassador, I am forced to turn away trainers and planners and aid contractors on a fairly regular basis. It slows the work. In terms of the other part of your question, it's important to recognize what we are doing in Colombia. The cap on civilian contractors applies to certainly some Defense Department civilian contractors, but the biggest number of civilian contractors are the ones who work in our fumigation program and in AID. This is kind of a one-size-fits-all legislative restriction, and it is impeding those programs. It is, for instance, impeding other sets of civilian contractors, for instance, were those who were training senior government leaders in their protection units, their bodyguards. The cap is interfering with the pace of activities and is slowing activities that could go forward with people identified, with money identified. They can't go forward simply because the number of contractors in Colombia can be capped. But let's turn to the more controversial aspect, and that's uniformed military. I would argue, again, the case on uniformed military is that we are not allowing training and planning to go forward for which we have money and for which we have personnel simply because of the cap. We achieved a redefinition of the cap a couple of months ago in which we loosened it slightly. For instance, up until a few months ago, the 3 U.S. hostages held by the FARC were counted against the civilian contractor cap, and any military officer flying through Colombian airspace was counted against the uniformed military cap. We've kind of adopted a rule of reason there. But What do uniformed American military do in Colombia? They work in the CON, which is the equivalent of the Pentagon at headquarters, and they deploy to no unit smaller than a brigade-size headquarters. They do not patrol. They do not go in harm's way. They are under instructions that unless they are actually themselves facing an immediate threat, if they hear gunfire, their job is to move in the other direction. They are doing nothing but providing training, planning, logistical support. And by the way, they're doing a magnificent job. When in a recent interview, I talked about, I said that in the 10 months plus that I've been in Colombia, I have visibly seen the public forces carry out operations with enormous success that were not possible to them when I arrived. I can tell you there is a direct linkage between the U.S. training and planning and equipping and that increased capability. So I would argue that rather than focus on the simple numbers, focus on the task. And the task is not to be involved in combat. It's not to go in harm's way. It is to help the Colombians fight our common enemy better.
Thank you. Question over here.
Mark Schneider, International Crisis Group.
Good to see you, Mark.
Good to see you. Two things. One, you indicated that you felt that it was important that at some point in the process, those paras who are not participating and not abiding by the ceasefire should bear the brunt, if you will, of the action of the government, military force, and police, etc. Why hasn't that been happening in the sense that the U.S. Congress voted to establish, urged and encouraged the establishment of a specific unit to go after paramilitary leadership as it did to go after the other illegal armed groups? And it's my understanding there's never been a unit that's formed, and its very formation would indicate the willingness of the government or determination of the government to carry out its policy of going after all illegal armed groups, particularly during this process of negotiating with those who are willing to negotiate and those that are not. Just one other. You mentioned the question about...
this was the easy one, right?
That's it. You mentioned that their one concern was that the paramilitary should not be allowed to retain illegally acquired assets. It's our understanding that they've been buying up land in the north at a fairly fast rate. Question is, are there any assets that they've purchased or acquired while they've been part of the paramilitary units that would not be illegally acquired?
Well, I'll answer the second question first because you're right. I was right. It was the easier one. In the case, for instance, of Simon Trinidad, he comes from an upper middle class family, and in fact, started out life with assets. So he may well have some assets that weren't illegally acquired. That doesn't mean, under the law of compensation and justice, that they couldn't be gone after. But I think at least in a legal environment, it would be difficult to start out with the assumption that all assets were ipso facto illegally acquired. But as I say, I think that there is a vehicle for going after both illegally acquired and legally acquired assets. Regarding the first part of the question, I guess I would provide a personal reaction that the paramilitaries, with something over 10,000, say 13 to 15,000 actives, is way beyond the scope of any specific unit. The numbers that we have seen and attempted to verify are that in the first 20 months of the Uribe administration, roughly twice as many paramilitaries have been killed or captured as during the immediately preceding 20 months at the close of the Pastrana administration. So we don't see the Uribe administration as going soft on paramilitaries, and as long as we don't see that, we're frankly slightly. That's the focus we want to maintain. I might add that in other areas, not under the control of the government, like substantial changes in the Fiscalía General in the Prosecutor General's office, which was also riddled with paramilitary sympathizers or collaborators or cooperators or accommodationists or however you want to create a hierarchy. We are convinced that the recent reforms, the firing of more than 20 senior prosecutors, the requirement that all remaining senior prosecutors undergo polygraphing, and steps toward creating an internal investigation unit that for the first time will have the authority, the independence, and the mandate to clean the place up a little bit. We think that kind of step is a good thing too. Lastly, and you have to take my word for it because I haven't got any evidence other than my own heart. But I have had long and detailed conversations with President Uribe about the paramilitaries, and I am personally satisfied that he views the paramilitaries as every bit as much a threat to Colombia as any of the other illegal armed groups or any of the less politically labeled but unbelievably destructive purer narco-trafficking organizations.
Good. Got a few more questions here, down here, Luis.
Luis Bittencourt, Wilson Center. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for this excellent synthesis about the overview about the Colombia situation. You start your presentation mentioning how difficult it is to provide support for peace in Colombia. And one of the things that cause concern in the region is, for the other countries, the neighbor countries, is certainly the presence of the United States helping Colombia. How do you see today the understanding in the region about the U.S. presence there, and how do you see the prospects for more cooperation from countries in the region also interested in the Colombia situation?
I think I would say two or three things. Certainly, people around the world are slightly ambiguous regarding the embrace of the gringos. That said, on the single most controversial, directly related U.S. issue, extradition, the polls have been moving steadily in our favor over time, and there is now roughly 50% support for extraditions. By the way, that means there is roughly 50% opposition. Certainly, I attempt to be as charming as I possibly can all the time. Bottom line, I think that we have a close, productive, and cooperative relationship inside Colombia, not simply because of the harder edge of our policy, our very strong support for military action, police action against narco-terrorism and illegal armed groups, but also because of the softer side of our policy. People do recognize that we are supporting development. People do recognize that we have now assisted something on the order of 1 million internally displaced persons. As you know, Colombia, according to the UN, has the third largest internally displaced population in the world, following Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Frankly, although the free trade agreement negotiations are highly controversial, and individual sectors are worried about how they're going to come out. In fact, it turns out to be a fairly positive initiative, and the closer commercial relationship between Colombia and the Andean region in general and the United States seems to be a fairly popular thing. So, although there is some resentment, I would have to conclude that that good relations with the United States is a plus. In the rest of the Andes, I think it's also a plus. And when they look at the budget numbers, frankly, I think that they wish that they were more, that the relationship was more like that of Colombia. I think I'd like to see it more like that of Colombia too, provided, of course, it didn't diminish anything provided to Colombia. But there's a question of political will. There's a question of institutional absorptive capability. It is relevant that 3 of the 5 Andean presidents barely make it into double digits in terms of level of popular approval. It's not because they're bad presidents necessarily, but it does have a direct impact on their ability to carry through difficult, ambitious, controversial policies. President Uribe was elected with about 54-55%, and he's now somewhere in the 70 to 75% approval level. He is able to withstand a certain amount of the normal political chaff that accompanies any open political process. And because of that, so what you have is a circumstance in which the nation facing the best financed, best defined, most violent threat also has the strongest presidency, the strongest institutions, and the clearest will to confront that threat. Under those circumstances, I would argue that we should continue to maintain high levels of support for all countries in the Andes, and I haven't got exact numbers, but we're putting in about $680 million a year, and $80 million into Colombia this year, and we're putting in over $1 billion to the Andean region as a whole this year. So although Colombia is unquestionably getting the lion's share, and we're not at the moment giving very much to Venezuela, although we are providing selected assistance, which means that Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia are dividing something on the order of $400 million in assistance, and that is not insignificant by historical standards. So we're not abandoning the rest of the Andes by any stretch of the imagination, but we are focusing on Colombia, hoping to establish a firm base of success there, and then hoping to export that success throughout the rest of the region.
I have 3 women that have their hands up, one first and then you're second.
My name is Winifred Tate. I'm an adjunct professor at American University. I had 2 questions. The first was on the issue of the indictments and extradition. Are there any precedents in peace talks of this nature where individual leaders are under indictment by the United States? What steps are being taken to actively pursue these indictments, and how could they possibly not interfere with this peace process, given that some of the senior leadership are under indictment? And the second is more broadly about your assessment of Uribe's human rights policies, specifically given the major investment that the U.S. has made in particular human rights agencies, the early warning system, and other kinds of governmental human rights initiatives. Thank you.
Why don't we a couple of the questions, 2 rows down. Another question. Is that all right?
Sure.
You can take
Sure.
all of them. Yep.
Thank you. Teresa Whitfield from New York University. You said that a bad peace is a bad deal, and I wonder, I mean, this is a long-term question, whether it's really possible to get a good peace under these terms. Unlike other kind of negotiating processes, what's on the table is not a substantive negotiation of an agenda for reform, but the terms by which the paramilitaries can come in, they obviously want to stay out of jail and hand over as few of their assets as possible. And that makes any kind of negotiations negotiation of compromise of aspects of peace and justice that you mentioned. And what I wonder is maybe the cost for the long-term stability and development of Colombia and the kind of Colombian state that you will end up with, even if things go well.
And the last question down here.
Oh, not Margaret. That's not really fair, you know.
Margaret Hayes. First of all, I hope that you will make your statement publicly available as soon as possible. It's excellent. But supposing, hypothesizing that the reason that the illegal groups would want to negotiate peace is that they're beginning to hurt because of the war and the anti-drug trafficking effort. Would you characterize how Colombia is doing in terms of winning the war, and what kind of progress is being made in controlling drug trafficking assets so that these people are hurting? And second, briefly, are we taking a long enough picture at the reinsertion program? 1 year perhaps isn't enough time to fund the re-education, retraining, and creation of job opportunities for all of these folks.
Now we'll give the ambassador 35 minutes to answer those three questions that turned into 6 or 7.
Well, I'd like to thank Winifred, Teresa, and Margaret. The questions don't actually form a very coherent whole, so let me try to answer them seriatim. As to whether or not there's a precedent for including extradition in a peace process or something like that, actually I don't care. It's not policy. We're not interested in it. We want these puppies, and we want them where we can get at them. Does it have an effect on the negotiations? You bet. They talk about it all the time. It has an effect in both directions, by the way. The inevitability of extradition is a source of uncertainty for the bad guys. President Uribe, and I commend to you the April 27th declaration that I mentioned. President Uribe, and I speak as an old UN negotiator, so I can spot careful use of language when I see it. He said, 1, extradition is not on the table. Colombia will not convert itself into an international pariah to benefit these bums. Third, to avoid extradition, they must convince the international community that they have changed their ways. The impact of, if a close reading of the declaration, as far as I'm concerned, is that the government of Colombia intends to go forward with extradition requests as long as the international community continues to submit them. We intend to continue submitting them. I might add that the United States is not the only one seeking extradition. Numbers of Colombians have been extradited. Numbers of criminals have been extradited to Spain and to Italy. And I think that there are openings for extraditions to other countries, because there are certainly some of these people have committed crimes against other countries under those other countries' laws. Anyway, I don't see a change in our posture toward extradition in the foreseeable future. Winifred, you asked, and Teresa also sort of touched on the question of Uribe's human rights record. This is coming at a difficult moment because, frankly, the President has made some recent statements about NGOs that have not been helpful and which the United States does not support. This is frankly confusing to me because inside of Colombia, President Uribe has worked hard to open up political space, pardon me, including for opposition leaders of the left. He actually has a pretty constructive relationship with the Polo Democrático, with Lucho Garzón, the mayor of Bogotá, Angelino Garzón, the governor of Valle de Cauca, and other opposition leaders from the left. He also has a pretty good relationship with opposition leaders from the right, but that won't come as quite a big surprise to you, so I won't stress that. He does feel, now by the way, the embassy has criticized his statements most recently in a Cambio article that came out over the weekend. He does feel appropriately proud of his human rights record. We share his pride in that human rights record. People are alive today who would not have been alive had he had a different human rights record. Officials, corrupt officials, have been fired. Corrupt military and police leaders have been fired. Members of the public security forces have been trained. The subject of human rights is not a subject over here, it's now sort of dead center. And so much of that has to do with the President's personal involvement and the activities of his senior-most appointees. At the same time, while he should be enormously proud of the distance that he has covered, and like all of us, when we are carrying out controversial and difficult policies, he is entitled to be frustrated when he sees others not paying enough attention to what he thinks is the distance that has been covered and focusing exclusively on the distance still to be covered. It is important that everyone realize there is still a difference to be covered. They aren't there yet. So we have some troubles with his statements about NGOs and others. I guess my last comment on well, let me leave it there and get into Teresa's questions about whether or not a good peace is possible with thugs and bums like these, and it's a swell question, and I don't know the answer to it. I only know that a good peace is worth trying, and it is worth trying for a couple of reasons. First, because simply the process itself has reduced violence against civilians. There are people who are alive today because the government launched on a fairly tough-minded basis the possibility of talks. You will hear in Medellin, for instance, how homicides in Medellin declined by 25% in 2002 and by roughly 45% in 2003. And at least one representative of an NGO of a not far-right nature told me 2 nights ago that he attributes it to what he referred to as the tregua, the truce between the government and the paramilitaries. Well, I don't think it's a truce, because a truce implies that the government is allowing the paramilitaries to go about their normal activities other than those activities that are specifically the subject of a truce. so I wouldn't use the word truce, but it is certainly the case that the peace process with the paramilitaries has contributed to the reduction of, in violence against civilians, and that's a good thing. I also completely agree that a bad peace, that is to say, and what do I define as a bad peace? I define as a bad peace one that does not change behavior definitively for those who are who go through the peace process. Teresa, you said it doesn't contain an agenda for reform. Well, the agenda for reform is occurring outside of the peace negotiations. If indeed it is sufficient, it seems to me, if those who well, it's not sufficient, but it is understandable if a peace process can end violent activities by those who would otherwise continue to commit violence and engage in other unlawful activities. Certainly that has been the standard, as I sort of indicated at the very beginning, applied in South Africa. It's the standard that is being sought in, to some degree, in Northern Ireland. It has been a recognized standard. In the Middle East, for instance, the value of peace, the value of reduction in violence against civilians is recognized to be a goal in and of itself worth pursuing, with the desire to add as many other worthwhile goals as possible to that one. So let's see. Yes, I do think that a good peace is possible. No, I'm not really in a position. A good peace with some people is possible. As I indicated in my presentation, I don't believe that by any means all of them are going to be willing to participate. And I'm really not in a position to give you much more definition as to what constitutes a good peace, except in those sort of metaphysical terms that I began in my presentation. And finally, Margaret. Well, there's a nice simple question. So how goes the war? Actually, the war goes pretty well. By every measure that the mission has. All of our missions are going well. First, drug trafficking. Records in fumigation, records in interdiction, records in extradition, records in prosecutions for money laundering, a new wrinkle. Military. By the way, very interesting study by a British group using the raw data coming from Justicia y Paz, but reconfiguring it into data relating to military encounters. Clearly, more sophistication, more professionalism, more cooperation among the military, more aggressiveness. They are out there, and sort of the simple-minded change is the military and the police used to go out against the bad guys, and having engaged them in some small part, because the bad guys, being guerrillas, would fall back rather than confront formed units. Then the military would retire back to the capital or back to their bases, and the bad guys would filter back. The big change, the big difference in Plan Patriota is they're there to stay. The planning is long-term. The logistics is based on long-term stay. It's very expensive. It's very hard. It's not a pleasant conflict. The government doesn't use anti-personnel landmines. The bad guys do. The majority of, actually, the government uses explosives, but they have to be detonated. They are not pressure sensitive or proximity sensitive. So if you don't mean for that thing to go off, a kid or a cow walking over it isn't going to set it off. The majority of the government's casualties come from landmines. We are in a tactical environment. In the last several months in the Plan Patriot area, we've discovered that the bad guys are putting landmines in trees and at sort of chest high, with chest high tripwires. And we discovered that soldiers are trained to look for tripwires on the ground. And as they're looking around, they walk into chest high tripwires, and actually a landmine sort of at chest high will do more damage to you than a landmine on the ground, under the ground. Similarly, we're finding that the bad guys seem, and by bad guys I mean the FARC, they seem to station snipers around minefields, so that when a squad or a platoon blunders into a minefield, the sniper's only job is to ensure that they can't exit the minefield the same way they entered, so that they have to go through more mines to get out rather than. So there are tactics involved. The government has unearthed reinforced tunnels, reinforced ammunition dumps, things like that. This isn't sort of the 7th Cavalry against Cub Scout Troop Number 7. These are bad guys. There are shortages. Shortages primarily in communications, logistics, and especially transportation. And one of our jobs is, and we have made, I think, and I'm very proud of this, over the last 10 or 12 months, we've made real progress in developing synergy among forces, a synergy between the counter-terror and the counter-drug effort. For instance, we now plan our spraying much more closely in line with their planning for the military. This constrains our spraying a little bit. This constrains their military operations a little bit. But what we're discovering is that rapid reaction forces for spray operations are the same rapid reaction forces you use for military operations. Medevac facilities for spray operations are also being used as medevac for military operations. So you're getting a bigger bang for your buck. The real question, of course, is when's it going to end? And it's not going to end soon. Colombia is a victim of the Mercator map projection. If you look at a map, it doesn't look as big as it is. In real life, it is the size of Texas plus California, plus a little. The population, 39 million of the population can be found in the California part, which is basically the 3 mountain valleys, the valleys between the 3 mountain ranges. In the Texas-sized part, there are a total of 4 million people. And the government has established a state presence, and it is carrying out military operations there. But this means, frankly, that the FARC has a huge distance they can fall back when they are under pressure. They have historically shown themselves perfectly willing to fall back in order to outlast a campaign, an offensive, or a president. We'll see what happens. Sorry, I can't be more specific than that, but I think that I can say that I think that we're satisfied.
Let us all thank Ambassador Wood for a marvelous presentation. Thank you very much. The second session will...
Sure. We'd like to invite you back at 1 o'clock, where we'll start with the first of the 2 afternoon panels. Our participants, the panelists themselves, will be joining us for lunch across the hallway. There's a food court down at the ground level of this building. We invite you to eat fast and come back quickly. Thank you.
Very sorry he wasn't here.
Oh, that's fine.
Whereabouts in Indiana are you from?
Well, I was raised in Fort Wayne, but I was born in Fort Wayne, but I grew up in New York City. So,
God.
You can have that, and I can send over yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, good.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
de apoyar la Presidenta Nacional, pero que como está en este momento, no quiere
Bueno, realmente no puedo explicar más, es que apoyamos, en términos políticos, apoyamos 100% el esfuerzo del señor Caramaño y de la OEA. Perdón. Y estamos buscando caminos, digamos, burocráticos para expresar este apoyo en una forma muy concreta. Y realmente financiera, sí.
Well, as I've already said, we've already provided several $100,000 to, and more is exactly the question. I can't help you. I can't help you.
Básicamente, ¿cuáles son las críticas que ustedes le hacen al proceso de paz paramilitar y hasta cuándo Estados Unidos está dispuesto a apoyar este proceso?
El valor del proceso de paz con los paramilitares depende 100% en el cumplimiento por parte de los paramilitares. Sin cumplimiento por parte de ellos, bueno, para empezar el proceso tiene que declarar la necesidad. Para continuar con el proceso tiene que cumplir con su declaración, tiene que concentrarse, tiene que dejar tiene que terminar sus actividades ilegales, incluso sobre todo el narcotráfico. Reconocer la autoridad y legitimidad del gobierno democrático del país y participar en la sociedad como ciudadanos, no como terroristas.
¿No va a haber delegado entonces de Estados Unidos en la mesa de negociación de los paramilitares?
Jamás. Pero no tenemos la más mínima idea. No sé. No tenemos datos. No tenemos esa información. Muchas gracias.
¿Va a estar por la tarde por acá?
No.
¿No? ¿Se va a
No.
Colombia?
¿Perdón?
¿Se va a Colombia otra vez?
Tampoco.
¿A dónde se va?
Bueno.
I'm really regret from Freddie Cherry.
Oh, great.
I'm a researcher at the Columbia University. And I'm
Great.
working right now on the demobilization of paramilitary and coming down to in August. I was wondering if there is any chance that you would have some.
Well, our aid mission is actually the ones who are really expert on this. And get in touch with them, and we can see what happens.
We can try.
Maureen Duggan.
Okay.
How about your presentation? Just so much
I just gave him to Michael. He's got them. So if you, Michael Van Dusen is the head of.
So he will make them available.
I assume.
May I ask you one question?